Hey Optimancers, Chris here. So I've been asked a number of times to do a Mage Hunter build. A number of these builds are floating around online, and I find usually they involve using Shadow Monk and or the Mage Slayer feat, and or Oath of Ancients Paladins, and or the Monster Hunter Ranger, and then they focus on hitting the mage with a melee weapon of some kind. Honestly, I've always figured that if you're taking on the mage or the archmage from the monster manual, then you really actually don't need a special build. They're both sitting on terrible constitution saves, and they haven't picked an appropriate selection of spells to deal with a bunch of pesky PCs. So if a berserking barbarian is your answer to them, you're probably going to be okay. However, this is an optimization channel, and if your DM watches this channel, there's a pretty decent chance that the mages your party comes up against aren't built terribly. So how do you defeat that kind of mage? A mage that has been built specifically to challenge PCs. That's the topic of today's video. If you would be interested in supporting the content of this channel, a link to my Patreon is in the video description. My patrons receive ad-free early releases of these videos, and my top-level patrons can join me each month to play some D&D. So let's get started. So what kind of mages can we expect if our optimizing DM makes them custom? Well, to begin with, they probably have a really good armor class. They may be wearing medium armor and a shield, or they may be blade singing, or as an absolute minimum, they will have a high dexterity score and mage armor. Then they'll have shield as a reaction to boost their armor class when they need a little bit more. They're also likely going to have something like mirror image to make it even harder to hit them. Secondly, they're probably going to have counterspell, so that enemy spellcasters can have their spell shut down. Thirdly, they'll probably have some blast options like Fireball or Magic Missile, but they're also going to have saver sucks like Hypnotic Pattern, Slow, Hold Person. Fourthly, they will have ways to hinder your movement. Maybe it's through the Web Spell, or Evert's Black Tentacles, or Walls of Force, or if their level is high enough, something like Force Cage. Finally, they'll have some ways to move themselves around. Things like Misty Step, Thunderstep, and Dimension Door. Now, if I'm thinking about what saving throws an optimized mage is likely going to be proficient in, then I'm usually going to be thinking about either the wizard or the sorcerer. So, Constitution, Wisdom, Charisma, and Intelligence, any of those could be proficient. However, with the base ability scores, I would expect high Dexterity, Constitution, and either Intelligence or Charisma. So when it comes to the saves that will likely be the best, in the case of wizards, Intelligence, in the case of sorcerers, Charisma, and regardless, always Constitution. So these are the saving throws we want to avoid. Saves like Wisdom and Dexterity will probably be middle of the road, and Strength is likely to be their worst saving throw. Now, what do we want in a Mage Hunter? So let's look at these options. First, let's talk about the Mage Slayer feat. I mean, this is the central theme of the build, so we definitely want this feat, right? Mage Slayer gives us three things. The first thing it gives us is a reaction attack against a spellcaster who casts a spell within 5 feet of us. Second is, if we damage a creature concentrating on a spell, the creature has disadvantage on its concentration saving throw. And third is, you have advantage on saving throws cast by creatures within 5 feet of you. So the first ability, I think, is not going to be that great. I mean, if we're assuming we have nothing better to do with our reaction, we make a weapon attack against a mage with high armor class, the shield spell, maybe even mirror images, I just don't think that's likely to pay off. The second ability, I think, is better. I mean, dropping concentration can be really helpful. However, what happens when that mage hits a +9 Constitution save? Then, unless you're doing more than 20 points of damage with each hit, it's not going to fail that save anyways, even if it has disadvantage. Any mage that is a challenge to a mid-level party, if it's made optimally, is going to have at least a +6 or +7 Constitution save, so even then, hitting for damage is probably not our best bet unless we can hit really, really hard. The third is advantage on saving throws against spells cast by a creature within 5 feet of you. The distance requirement is a big deal, by the way. Also, magic resistance can be gained as a racial feature by multiple races now, like Yuan-Ti and Satyrs, and other races have partial resistance, like gnomes for example, and in none of those cases is the 5-foot limit imposed. So when I look at these features in detail, I think we're getting abilities that aren't going to do the job all that well, which makes me think the most effective Mage Slayers will not have spent an ability score increase to get the Mage Slayer feat. So let's take a look at the Shadow Monk. First off, I do get the thought process. The stunned condition from Stunning Strike would be devastating if it landed on a mage. And Shadow Monks in particular get the ability to cast Darkness without components, which messes up a mage's ability to cast spells that require seeing the target, Silence, which can mess up a mage's ability to use verbal components, and they get Shadow Step, which can allow them to escape things like Web or Wall of Force. Finally, if you do take Monk to high enough levels, you will get Evasion at level 7, Stillness of Mind at 9, and Diamond Soul at 14, all of which are abilities that look like they would be really useful going up against a spellcaster. So does Shadow Monk make a good Mage Slayer? I'd say they make a better Mage Slayer than other monks do, but honestly I do think we can do a lot better. Let's go through those abilities in a little more detail and I'll explain why I don't think this is a great Mage Slaying subclass. First off, at level 3 they can cast Silence and Darkness without material components. Now, Darkness I actually don't think is all that good against an enemy mage. Mages have lots of spells that aren't going to rely on sight, so Darkness just makes them use those spells, which isn't all that much of an advantage to us, certainly not worth our action and concentration. Now, Silence could be a great spell against a mage. Now, that doesn't mean the mage can't cast any spells. There are spells that don't have verbal components. Hypnotic Pattern, for example, doesn't have a verbal component. But the list isn't that long, so unlike Darkness, this really does cut down the mage's options significantly. The problem with Silence, though, is that you need to find a way to prevent that mage from moving. Silence doesn't move, so if the mage can just move out of the effect, then we wasted the spell and the action to cast it. So what is the monk going to do to prevent this movement? Stunning Strike? Okay, let's talk about Stunning Strike. First thing, Stunning Strike requires a to-hit roll. If we're talking about a mage out of the back of the monster manual, that's not a problem, as I mentioned. But if the mage has been built effectively, this is a really big problem. Expect that enemy mage to have maybe a 20 armor class without magical equipment, and 25 with a shield spell, maybe higher, and possibly mirror images on top of that. So our monk, maybe at 5th level, might have a +6 or so to hit, which means even with Flurry of Blows, they're likely not going to hit even once. But if they do, let's say they hit, then the wizard makes a saving throw, and what save are we hitting? Constitution, which is the only saving throw we can be 100% certain an optimized mage is going to be good at. So monks actually combine the two worst things to combat a mage: reliance on weapon attacks and an effect that targets constitution saves. But what about Shadow Step? Well, teleports are a thing lots of characters can do, but to my knowledge Shadow Monk is the only one that gets foiled by a light cantrip or completely foiled by a daylight spell. Don't get me wrong, Shadow Step is a good ability. It's just not an ability we can't duplicate without those hindrances. And what about the other monk stuff? Well, evasion is certainly handy to have if you're going to go against mages who throw fireballs. However, two things. First, I wouldn't count on an optimized enemy mage to be throwing spells that give you a dexterity save for half damage all that much. Secondly, even if you do, so let's say that enemy mage is getting off so many of those fireballs at you and your party that you needed evasion to stay up. Well, then your party's dead, and having a so-called Mage Slayer in the party obviously didn't do them much good. What about Stillness of Mind? There's a pretty good chance that an optimized mage is going to hit you with a Charm or Frightened effect, so abilities that deal with this could be really helpful. The problem with this one is you need to use your action to end the effect, whether you're hit with a Tasha's Hideous Laughter, or a hypnotic pattern, or a fear spell, or any other of a number of spells that charm or frighten you, you don't usually get to choose what you do with your action. So for dealing with the dragon's fear aura, this could be really handy. But as a Mage Slayer ability, it's just not really helpful at all. So what about Diamond Soul? This would give us proficiency in every saving throw, and yeah, proficiency in all saves would be really helpful. But this is coming way, way too late. Most campaigns end before you even get to 14th level. So as I said, I understand the gut instinct to go for Shadow Monk. The abilities really sound like they fit a mage slaying build. But if you analyze them closely, they tend to either not work well, or can be duplicated or improved upon by different features or spells. Of course, it shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone that I don't think the Shadow Monk is up to the job. Other subclasses I hear about when talking about mage hunting are Oath of the Ancients Paladins, Arcane Domain Clerics, and Monster Hunter Rangers. I won't go into as much detail about these ones, but let's go through some highlights. When it comes to the Oath of the Ancients Paladin, we're really talking about two things. The first is the Aura of Protection that any Paladin gets. This is going to give you higher saving throws, and it's also going to give any party members near you those same saving throws. And that is really good. Now, it requires 6 levels of Paladin to get there, so it doesn't come cheap. But if you could put it on a Mage Slaying build, it's definitely good. But the reason we're talking about Oath of Ancients in particular is the 7th level ability, and that's their Aura of Warding. And what that does is creatures that are in your protective aura also have resistance to the damage from spells. Now, if you're going to have resistance to damage from spells, that's good. It's going to be useful on a mage slaying build. But I don't think it's as useful as some people indicate it would be. Because, again, if you're playing against an optimized mage, they're doing more than just throwing fireballs at you. So if you are just taking on a fireball tossing mage, it's really great. But if we are dealing with mages that are using a variety of useful spells, I would think it could come up, but I don't think it's going to come up as often as people might think. Now, when it comes to Monster Hunter Rangers, people are usually thinking about the higher level abilities. Magic User's Nemesis is probably the first thing they're thinking of, and this is an 11th level ability that when you see a creature casting a spell or teleporting within 60 feet of you, you can use your reaction to try to foil it. And it needs to make a wisdom saving throw, and if they fail, the spell is lost or the teleport fails. This, I think, actually is more importantly able to stop teleports that don't use spellcasting. So, as in teleports not done by a mage. Like, there are certain demons and devils that get teleport abilities, and you can stop it with this ability, and that's really good. But when it comes to just taking on a mage, this is probably just straight out worse than counterspell. And counterspell is something you can get at 5th level. Magic User's Nemesis comes at 11th level. So although I don't think this is a bad ability to have if you're fighting mages, I definitely don't think it is worth going for 11 levels of Monster Hunter just to get it. So why are Arcane Domain Clerics, why are they considered decent mage hunters? Well, I think it mostly comes down to the 6th level ability. They have an ability called Spellbreaker. So if it's called Spellbreaker, they must be good Mage Slayers. And what Spellbreaker does is if we cast a spell that restores hit points to an ally, we can also end one spell of our choice on that creature. And the level of the spell we end must be equal or lower to the level of spell we use when we cast the healing spell. Now, in general, I think Dispel Magic is better. Because if you cast Dispel Magic on somebody who has magical effects on them, it is going to remove all the spells, and you even have a chance to remove the spells that are higher level than the Dispel Magic spell. The one way Spellbreaker could be better is if we have multiple allies that have a spell effect and we want to get rid of it. So let's say a hypnotic pattern appears on our party. Now the way Dispel Magic is worded, there is some question. If you cast Dispel Magic on hypnotic pattern, does it remove the hypnotic pattern from all the creatures or just the one creature? And that isn't super clear in the rules, but the way Jeremy Crawford has talked about Dispel Magic in the past, in regards to other questions, suggests that it might just be the one creature. In that case, Spellbreaker could be better. So if you do a mass healing word on the entire party, then potentially you could remove Hypnotic Pattern on the entire party. Though that party better have been damaged, because even if you cast a healing word on a party member with Hypnotic Pattern, you don't remove the Hypnotic Pattern unless you restore hit points to that creature. So they better be wounded in the first place, or it's not going to do anything. Overall, this is a somewhat useful ability in mage hunting, but I don't think it's worth 6 levels of cleric to get it. And I don't think it does enough different from Dispel Magic to make it worth that kind of investment. So what do we want on a mage hunting build? I think we can separate it into 6 things. There are 6 things I'd put on any mage hunting build that I made. Number 1, there's got to be a way to hinder the mage's ability to cast spells. So let's, for example, go back to the silence spell. How can we make the silence spell work? Well, we would need a way to keep the mage from leaving the silence effect. Maybe we grapple them, or a rocked mud, or some other form of hindered movement. With a silence up, a lot of teleport options to get out of that space won't be available either. Honestly, grappling is not a bad option at all here. Here's a weird thing about grapple. Because it's technically not an attack, mirror image doesn't work against it. Because mirror image will only work if you are attacked. Also, it's not likely the mage is going to have a great chance to resist. Finally, the mage's great armor class is not a factor. So we can even use grapple to grab a mage that left the silence effect and drag them back in. Another way we might be able to hinder their ability to cast spells is with counterspell. I mean, obviously. Really, how are there so many Mage Slayer builds out there without counterspell? It seems to me like the first thing I would make sure I have. Ideally, we would want our counterspell to have a decent chance of stopping higher level spells as well. So any ability score boosts we could get would be great. Whether we generate those ourselves, or maybe we get a bardic inspiration from a helpful party member. But I think you got some nerve calling your build a mage hunting build if you don't have counterspell. And Dispel Magic. Again, this seems like a no-brainer to me. A single Dispel Magic can cancel out every single buff that a mage put on themselves. It can also help the rest of the party out of spell effects. I mean, ideally, we would like to prevent those effects in the first place with something like Counterspell, but if that doesn't happen, then Dispel is your next best option. So that's number 1. We need to be able to hinder mages' abilities to cast spells. Number 2, we need movement. Any mage worth their salt is going to try to lock you down, maybe with a web, all the way up to Force Cage if it's a high-level caster. Now, Disintegrate might be a way to lower that Force Cage, but it's a pretty high-level spell. It's more likely we'll need to take our chances with a teleport. A simple Misty Step might take care of most of these issues, or a Dimension Door or Thunderstep if we also want to get another PC out of trouble. But if we want to get out of a Force Cage, now here's the thing about Force Cage. So a creature in the cage can't leave it by non-magical means, so we're going to need magic. If the creature tries to use teleportation or interplanar travel to leave the cage, it must make a charisma saving throw. On a success, the creature can use the magic to exit the cage. On a failure, the creature can't exit the cage and waste the use of the spell or the effect. And the cage also extends into the ethereal plane, blocking ethereal travel. So if we want a Misty Step or Dimension Door out of a Force Cage, we're going to be able to need to make a charisma saving throw. So when we look at our saving throws, having a good charisma save is probably a good idea. Now, fast movement will also be useful for us. It can get us up to an enemy caster if we want to grapple them in a silence spell, for example. There are a lot of ways we can get fast movement, but we want at least one of them. The third thing that I would want on any mage hunting build is, because I'm almost certainly going to be a spellcaster, I don't want my spells to be counterspelled. If we're going to be using spells to hinder this mage's spellcasting, we can bet they're going to try to do the same. So what is our answer to that? Well, it's subtle spell meta magic. This does 2 amazing things for us. First, we aren't going to be using somatic or verbal components, so the mage won't see us casting a spell, which means we can't be counterspelled. Second, since we can remove the verbal components, we can cast inside the silence, including our own silence that we're likely going to have at our disposal. So subtle spell meta magic to me is an absolute must on a mage hunter build. And frankly, I'm kind of hoping the enemy mage doesn't have subtle spell, because that's going to make my job a whole lot harder. Number 4, we need to be able to break that mage's concentration. Don't expect a well-made mage to fail a concentration save when you do 20 points of damage or less. I mean, you might get lucky, but I just wouldn't expect it. Since we're unlikely to hit with attacks, it makes breaking concentration through damage delivery unlikely anyways. A magic missile in the back pocket might be a good thing to have, just to deliver a few saves at once, but really there are going to be 4 good ways to interrupt concentration. The first is a spell that requires a higher DC concentration save, something like a Sleet Storm, for example. The second is delivering a huge amount of damage with a single effect. That's going to increase the DC of the concentration save and make it more likely to fail. The third is to incapacitate the mage. There are a number of spell effects that can do that. And the fourth is to dispel the spell they're concentrating on. I mean, how often do you hear people talking about breaking concentration and they don't mention just dispelling the spell they're concentrating on? I mean, it seems like a pretty good way to me, as then it doesn't really matter what the mage's saves are, because they're not getting a saving throw. Now, as I mentioned, depending on the spell, one dispel magic spell may not dispel the entire effect, but I think in a lot of cases it will. The fifth thing I'd have on any Monster Hunter build is a way to actually slay the mage. So here's the thing. We can silence the mage, counter their spells, grapple them, run circles around them, but ultimately to defeat them, we actually need to be able to take them out of the fight. Now, I have to assume again, we're playing in a party, so if you deliver a silenced, prone, and grappled mage that you've done a dispel magic on, then there's going to be party members that can finish the job for you. However, we know what kind of saves the mage is going to have. If we can take out the mage with a spell, then ideally that spell needs to target strength, but failing that, wisdom or dexterity. If we can take them out without providing a saving throw, all the better. And finally, the sixth thing I'd have on any mage hunting build, and this is last but definitely not least, we need to be good against other things. Unless you are picking your own challenges, if you're playing D&D, you're not always going to be fighting mages. In fact, usually you aren't. And it's okay to specialize for that moment where you are, but we still want to be effective when it isn't that moment. So when I'm making a mage hunting build, I'm going to be thinking about hunting mages, but I'm also going to be thinking about, is this character going to be effective when I'm not hunting mages? And those are the 6 things I think any good mage hunter worth their salt is going to have. They're going to have a way to hinder the mage's ability to cast spells. They're going to have enhanced movement options, ideally with teleports. They're going to have a way to cast spells without being counterspelled. They're going to have ways to break concentration. They're going to have ways to actually slay the mage, and they're going to be good in other situations besides just fighting mages. So now is when I say I'll be making just such a build that I'll be presenting, you guessed it, next time. So I hope you'll join me for the real Mage Hunter in my next video. Until then, I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks everybody. Talk to you soon.